Welcome to Partners in Health and Biz with your host, Wendy Meyeroff. Tune in every Saturday for great shows about obtaining and maintaining health, business, and finance. Learn from the experts here at pihradio.net. And now, broadcasting from the Partners in Health and Biz studio, here's Wendy.
Thanks again, Gail Dixon, my co-host on Partners in Health and Biz. This is indeed Wendy Meyeroff, your business co-host, and each Saturday morning, my wellness genius, Gail Dixon, and I offer all sorts of great insights with special awareness whenever we can, as often as we can, for the older market that we reach. And that means folks ages 55 and older, their caregivers, their loved ones, and also their professional healthcare providers. So this week's show is about volunteering. And if you think we don't need folks now that the shutdown is over as I record this, think again for a variety of reasons, I'm sorry to say. First, before we even get into why you should volunteer, let me remind you or inform you, in case you don't know some of these things, of great people who also volunteered, and they may not be as well known for that part of their lives. For example, we all know about founding father Ben Franklin. Do you know that he actually created the very first volunteer fire department in Philadelphia? It was a group of 30 men. It goes back to 1736, and he formed the Union Fire Company. So that was Franklin. I don't know how many of you remember the fellow who originally played Superman in the movies, Christopher Reeve. He was paralyzed after getting thrown off a horse. He was a quadriplegic. And so he became very involved in helping others who had suffered spinal cord injuries, and that includes acting as the volunteer chairman of the American Paralysis Association. Okay, maybe you don't all know Christopher Reeve, but I bet everybody heard of Agatha Christie. She became a nurse in the aid detachment, volunteers of the Red Cross Hospital, when her husband was fighting in World War I. So she was a volunteer nurse from 1914 to 1917. And I'll give you one more quick example, Ella Fitzgerald. This lady did some singing on a public service announcement for free for the March of Dimes, and that was back in 1958. She wanted to alert others and bring attention to the fight against polio. So those are just a few people who believed in volunteering. Those are the names you'll probably know or your loved ones will know. Let's do a quick brief overview of true volunteerism, because we've got people being called volunteers. It's been somewhat redefined. All those folks who stayed at their jobs without pay during the shutdown have been called volunteers, and they're not really. One report from a magazine I read about the aviation industry said, quote, 14,000 volunteers continue to work the skies amidst government shutdown, and they had volunteers in quotes because they knew these people were not volunteers. They're brave enough to recognize the dangers to the U.S. and beyond from crashing aircraft and what it does to the people, of course, but that's not volunteering. They worked because they were brave enough to do so. Another report I saw actually came out of NASA, and this one I was surprised with. NASA asked employees to volunteer to clean bathrooms, and again, this was people working without pay. So all this is sad, and this is not true volunteerism the way it's defined. Real stories about volunteerism, some of them I'm sure you folks know already. It's Habitat for Humanity, the Red Cross, and others that are well known. But some of the other stories I found while I was looking online is, for example, there's a group in San Francisco picking up trash, and the news show says that even now that supposedly the shutdown's over, volunteers are still taking it upon themselves to clean up the Bay Area's federal parklands. That's a quote. And it list places, for example, like Fort Mason and the aquatic park in that area. I found a group in D.C. that has what's called Goody Girl bags, something most of us forget about donating. It's sanitary pads, tampons, and other feminine hygiene products. And as I said earlier, since we focus here on Partners in Health and Biz about seniors, we have to remember that we have a lot of older women. It happens at all ages, but especially to older women as they have trouble with incontinence. So we have the feminine bladder control panties. So that's probably something you could put in a Goody Girl bag. The diaper bank, again in DC, looked for all sorts of baby supplies. So it's things like, of course, diapers and formulas and wipes, but also any gently used furniture and things like baby bathtubs. And then, of course, through all of this volunteering, there's this things most of us know locally is things like food banks in our areas. So there are all sorts of places. It's not a problem truly of finding a place to volunteer. It's about volunteering wisely. So there are 3 checkpoints I always give people if they're going to volunteer. First of all, admit your true skills. Don't figure you can take over all of a group's fundraising just because you click coupons brilliantly and you know how to save. You're a natural born salesman, and so you do a real solid admission of what your skills really are. Writing, teaching, sales, fundraising, music. Where can you truly fit in? Then that leads to point number 2. Review honestly your time restriction. A colleague pointed out to me that it's really easy to be lured into almost a full-time position, but if you can't truly dedicate yourself to it and your timeline to it, you won't get it right. So say things like, I'm so thrilled to devote myself to working with your group, but it's my 2 hours weekly, or I'm so happy to help you on a Saturday morning, or working in your gift shop at these dates and times, anything like that. Make sure you affirm what you can really do. And then the third key point, of course, is focus on what you love to do. Maybe you could devote yourself to, let's say, the accounting office, because that's what you're training to learn. So that can be something that helps you. But if you take on something you really can't stand just because that's where they need the volunteers, so for example, if the nonprofit near you is going to do a 5-mile run to raise money, and you can't stand standing with the crowd and giving out water bottles to the racers, and instead you might be able to work with pet sitting. Or vice versa. Maybe you can't stand cats, dogs that will be pet sitters. Then don't do it. So focus on what you love. Admit your true skills, review your time restrictions, and then focus on what you love. So those are the 3, I should say, key points. Now comes one of the difficult parts. I call it shame, shame, go away. Because it's tough for many people to say no. I've just given you reasons why to turn down certain jobs they ask you to do. But that's tough for many people. I found a story a few years ago in Scientific American, and they put it this way, talking about the word no, just the word no, followed by I really can't do this, or it's not my area, or whatever, but just the word no. It's one of the smallest, shortest words in the English language, but one of the hardest to say, end quote. And I wouldn't be surprised if saying no is very difficult in many languages, no matter how short it is. I've also found, from my experience, of course it's true for anybody, it can be hard to say no, but it can be especially hard for those of us we talk with who are seniors. When I've interviewed people, whether it's the seniors themselves or their families or their doctors of some kind, it can be very hard. They're trained to always be giving, especially if you're still dealing with someone who came just during World War II or right afterward. They were taught to give up and to help others and make sure they donated or whatever. And it can be, there's good news and bad news for older volunteers, especially if they're retired, then they have the time. But on the other hand, those same people who used to be really able to help their local food bank or their religious group or their PTA or whatever, they may be on tighter budgets. Maybe they're not as mobile. If you don't have mobility in this country, you can't get anywhere to help. So that means don't just give up and sit there staring out the window. It means you really have to look for other opportunities. Talk to the folks, the groups for which you used to volunteer, and ask them, are there other ways you can help them? And if not, well, then ask them if they know any other places, so you don't just sit there and waste away. If you're working for a company, you're a staff job, well, there's sort of good news. Many companies now have community relations or corporate outreach programs, and they're dedicated to certain charities, and you can go into wherever it is, human resources, you find out where in your company that you're working for, find out where you have to touch base. You might even be able to first do it online. Find out what kind of volunteers they need. Do they need artists? Do they need billing people? Do they need chefs, for example? What kind of help do the organizations your company helps need? And which volunteer groups? Sometimes there's 3, 4, or 5. So it could be ASPCA, it could be the local food bank, it could be whatever charities your company supports. So find out, because they usually then, the current ones, especially the bigger ones, they're giving away time. They'll give you X number of hours per month. It can even help raise your rating and look good in your credentials in a company. If it's a smaller company and they don't have an official program, you could bring it up to whoever oversees you directly, or even if you have direct link to the leader, and say, look, have we ever considered helping the local homeless charity, or whatever is your interest? And maybe they won't accept that one, but they like the idea in general. So that might work out. If it's your own biz, I remember a colleague saying to me, well, that's one of the perfect ways and reasons to have our own businesses, because we have the option of figuring out our time off. We can do it every Tuesday morning or whatever, and we have up and down portions in our business. So we know that, okay, when it gets really busy, we might have to opt out a certain year, or maybe we can only do one board meeting a month and we can't be a full-time person who comes in. Maybe it's only once a quarter instead of once a month. But it's your own business and you are able to do that. And remember, if we're talking for supporting seniors, if we're talking to those of you in healthcare, maybe you can donate your services at a local clinic X number of times a month or a quarter or whatever. I know a lady who teaches sit-down Zumba classes in an apartment complex where most of the residents are in their 70s, 80s, and even people in their 90s come. One person has an oxygen tank with him, but it's sit down, and he does as much or as little as he can. So figure out where you stand. But whatever you do, be wary of volunteer overload. I remember working for a religious group that I had joined, and I'm working on the newsletter in my work in health communications. That's one of the projects I do all the time. And so it was relatively easy. I only did the copies. They had a template already done up. We had a volunteer graphic designer who polished it off. But then I got asked for tons of other stuff to write and develop and so forth. And there came a point where I could do certain things periodically, but I also had to know that I couldn't totally take over as the PR director or the communications officer or whatever. I just couldn't do it. Otherwise, I'd never make money. So you have to know, especially running my own business. Maybe if I'd been a staff person, I could do certain things, but even then, you'd have to have X amount of time. Is it stuff you could all do at home and then submit it and leave it on the internet? Well, then maybe you don't mind putting in all those extra hours at home. Most of us can't really do it that way, which is why we get back to the shame, go away concept. Remember, here are 4 quick tips. Remember, You're not doing something morally wrong by saying no. The Scientific American story I noted earlier, where it defines the word no, it includes information from Ellen Hendrickson. She's a PhD who apparently is called the Savvy Psychologist. And she says when you're not doing something morally wrong, you have to remember that you're not lying. You're not selling fake lottery tickets. That's my example, by the way. By turning something down. This is not a terrible thing that you're doing. You're not deliberately hurting someone. Some people think, oh, I know she's going to get mad, which, by the way, the word mad should really be angry, but nobody gets that right. So, you say, oh, I know he or she is going to get mad. Well, first of all, that's highly unlikely, but if this person who's supervising and coordinating volunteers and looking